Hey, welcome back to our study on the Gospel of Mark. Today we're going to be in Mark chapter 8. There's a lot of stuff in Mark chapter 8 that we could talk about. There's the feeding of the 4,000. There's this section called the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod, where the disciples are kind of confused. They think that Jesus is talking about bread, when in reality he's talking about the spirit of legalism and sort of the established cult order and stuff like that. There's where Peter declares that Jesus is the Messiah, and that's a pretty important scene in the gospel. There's the first prediction of Jesus' death, and then where Jesus talks about the way of the cross, where he says that famous line, "Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the sake of the gospel will save it." We could talk about all those things, and maybe in future videos that we'll talk about them, but there's one section today that I really think is worth looking at, and that's verses 22 through 26. And before I read it, I want to ask you a question. Does Jesus ever do anything halfway? When you think of Jesus, is there anything that comes to your mind where you think, man, I bet Jesus would have a hard time with this? Like, I bet he would struggle with that. Maybe it's like curing cancer or some other type of disease. Maybe it's something trivial like since Jesus is a Jew, would he have a hard time eating bacon? That would be a hard one for me. Is there anything that you can think of though where you're like, I wonder if there is just something that's really, really hard for Jesus to do? And so we ask the question, is there anything that Jesus does halfway? Personally, I can't really think of anything that Jesus can do halfway, but there's actually this story in Mark chapter 8, verses 22 through 26, where it seems that Jesus struggles a bit with something, and in this case, it's going to take Jesus 2 attempts to heal a blind man. And here's what happens. Verse 22, Jesus and his disciples came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand, and he led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" The man looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were open and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't even go into the village." So, it's kind of a weird passage, right? Like, there's a couple different things going on. First of all, the bigger picture is that it took Jesus 2 attempts in order to heal this blind man. But then there's also elements like he spits on the guy, and then he lays his hands on him. And then the guy says that he sees people walking around, but they look like trees. And then Jesus touches him again, and that ultimately, results in his healing. So let's kind of walk through a couple of those details. First of all, let's talk about the use of spit and the laying on of hands. The laying on of hands is something that we're actually pretty familiar with in the church these days, right? When we're talking about praying for people and talking about healing and those kinds of things, especially when we're asking in our prayers for God to heal someone, we typically gather around them and we lay our hands on them. Or more recently, especially in these days, we kind of just extend almost like, "I'm with you." I'm with you, even though I may not be able to touch you in this moment. I'm with you. Or a large crowd, I'm pushing almost like my energy towards you in a way, like I'm with you. It's a symbolism type thing, right? But in the ancient world, it was very important that physical contact was there because, especially when we're talking about Jesus, we're talking about something holy coming into contact with something that maybe is not so holy. And something that is holy, at least regarding God's holiness, cannot be tainted by something that is unholy. The unholiness has to become holy because of God's holiness. It's like bleach, right? Bleach that touches anything is going to bleach it, whereas it doesn't go the other direction. Color does not affect bleach. Bleach affects color. In the same way, Jesus' holiness affects the unholiness of other people. Their unholiness does not affect him. And so in the ancient world, there was this mindset of like touching conveyed sort of a communal aspect, a transfer almost between two individuals. But the use of spit is probably the aspect of this particular story that we don't quite understand. I remember reading a story a while back about this woman, I think maybe in somewhere in Asia, who, and this is going to be gross, but who she's considered a miracle worker because she has this process where she kind of disinfects her mouth and then she'll go to people and lick their eyeballs in order to clear out diseases that these folks have in their eyes. Not really my thing. Nope. I prefer eye drops, stuff like that. Not somebody's spit, and certainly not somebody's tongue in my mouth, or my eye. So in this situation, it seems kind of strange that Jesus took the blind man by the hand, led him outside, and then he spat on the man's eyes. In our culture, you spit in somebody's face, it's an insult. In that culture, spit was believed to have some sort of healing capabilities to it. So Jesus is functioning within his cultural dynamics in this situation. He's playing ball, essentially, with the cultural expectations on how to do some miracles. He doesn't do this all the time. In fact, as far as I know, this is the only time. I think he spits one other time and makes dirt, like a dirt clod with it, and then rubs it on somebody's eyes. In this case, he just spits straight into the guy's eyes, and then he lays hands on him. All of it has to do with healing and whatnot, but just as a detail of that story, it's a bit odd, but it fits with the way that this culture in this time and place understood how these things work. Now, when Jesus does this, the man responds. He says, I see people, but they look like trees walking around. I see people and they look like trees walking around. And for many of you, you might actually have difficulty seeing. You might wear glasses or contacts. Maybe you have astigmatism, nearsightedness, farsightedness. My wife in particular has, I don't know what she has. She has bad eyes is what she's got. And she tells me all the time about how sometimes it's rough for her to drive at night. She just can't see very well sometimes. It's hard for me. I have really good eyesight, so it's hard for me to imagine what it's like to look at people and like, yeah, you can make out their shape and you know that it's a person, but it looks like a tree walking around. It's a bit strange. In other words, Jesus' first effort to heal this man of his blindness resulted in him being able to only kind of make out broad shapes. He couldn't see the finer details of things. He can only make out like, okay, that just looks like a stump moving across my field of vision here. So Jesus lays his hands on this man again, and the man's eyes are opened, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And that's how the story goes. Nothing special that time. He didn't spit in the man's eyes again. He just laid his hands on him second time, and the man was good to go. But this raises a big question, doesn't it? Like, why? Why did Jesus have to even do this twice, right? Did the first time not take? Was the first time not good enough, right? Like, did Jesus not have enough spiritual energy in that first moment? Or did the man not have enough faith or something like that? There's no mention of any of that kind of stuff. It's just Jesus had to put his hands on the guy twice in order to heal him. So what gives? Why is this story, for one, why is this story in the gospel? And two, what does it mean? Well, I think that this story is in the gospel because Mark is interested in showing us that the disciples, you remember that very first session that we had, we talked about a couple of themes, and one of them had to do with the disciples. The disciples get it, and the disciples don't get it. The disciples are a paradox. So in this scene, Mark is using this blind man's example as a sort of type of understanding the disciples. The disciples don't get it. They still do not see clearly. They still don't see the details of who Jesus is and what he's about. It serves as an example of the blindness, not of the man, but of the disciples. And the truth of the matter is even today, you and me and some people in our friend zone and in our sphere, sometimes we also are very simply unable to see and understand the work of God around us. There's a great song. You've probably heard it. You've probably sang it. I know I've sang it. I've played it a million times. It's called Open the Eyes of My Heart. And that really ought to be a prayer that we regularly pray. Because we have this tendency, this proclivity, that sometimes we just become blind to what God is doing around us. We become ignorant of the ways in which he is moving in our lives and in the lives of other people. And my friends, it is impossible to align ourselves with what he's doing if we are unaware of what he's doing. It's impossible for us to love other people if we can't see them clearly. It's impossible for us to follow Jesus if we can't see him clearly. If everything just looks like trees walking around, or worse, if everything's just dark, then how in the world are we supposed to follow him? And so our prayer, and my prayer for you, and I think our takeaway from this short story today is we need to be asking God regularly to open the eyes of our hearts. Maybe he needs to open our eyes literally, physically, like, man, how many times and how many physical signs does he need to throw our way in order for us to see? But maybe for many of us, it's much more a spiritual thing of when are you going to wake up and recognize who I am? When are you going to wake up and realize what Jesus came to do and who he is and what he's trying to do in your life and what he's trying to do in the lives of your parents and your family and your friends and those around you? What is he trying to do through the church? And so that's our prayer, right? That's our prayer. God, open our eyes. Open our eyes that we may be fully and completely aware of who you are and what you're trying to do. Because we don't want to miss it. We don't want to be so ignorant of these things that tomorrow we wake up and it's too late, or tomorrow we wake up and all we can see are people that look like trees walking around. We want to see their faces, and more importantly, we want to see your face, the details of who and what you are. And so open our eyes, physically, spiritually, all of it. In your name, amen.